We welcome in Shehan Jeyarajah. Let's just call him, he's a friend of the show. Instant friend. Thank you so much for taking the time. Shehan and I, you can see it. It's going to be on ESPN. I think it's ESPN2 on Thursday night it airs. We just filmed the last football episode, or maybe one more of Inside the 12. Shehan, of course, with CBS Sports. We do appreciate you taking the time with us yesterday. It was an awesome show. And to welcome you underneath the Big 12 tent, which you really have been under for a long time. I want to start you off with the question about, obviously, the college football playoff released about 18 hours ago. What was your biggest surprise from the most updated rankings in the release?
Yeah, for me, not a ton of huge surprises, but I was fascinated to see how the committee would handle that 11, 12, 13 range with Alabama, Miami, with Ole Miss, with South Carolina, all one after the other. I do ultimately think that they probably got it right with Alabama being the top of that group. I mean, the reality is, right, it's kind of that one spot was the only one that was up for grabs. I think that almost everybody else is accounted for. And by the way, with Clemson playing SMU, if Clemson wins that game, that's probably a bid stealer pushing Alabama out. So that was the one that I was most interested to see. I was also curious, too, where Ohio State was going to land. I think that they got it right with Ohio State being at number 6. To me, they are a clear step ahead of a team like Tennessee, which has 1 top 11 win. Ohio State has 2 top 10 wins. So overall, I think that they got the playoff bit right. I just wish they didn't talk after it was released.
What do you mean by that?
Well, after this happens, right, of course, Ward Manuel, the chair of the CFP committee, goes on TV and has a media call afterwards. And he said on the call, he was asked, well, could SMU fall behind Alabama if they lose the AC title game? And he's like, well, potentially. I don't know what the need is to say that. Like, I think that that's one of those things, and we've heard all year long that the committee does not deal in hypotheticals. Well, you just entertained a hypothetical that you didn't have to entertain. I don't even know why you'd say something about it at that point. The other one, too, was that he specifically pointed to Alabama versus Miami's records against teams over 500, where it was like 6-1 versus 4-2, something like that. And the thing is that one, Alabama, that means, is 3-2 against teams that are 500 or worse. And the other piece, too, is that if you put that to 500 or better, then Miami also has 6 wins. It's just that they're at the 500 points. So, again, when you start trying to, again, and I want to be sympathetic to the committee chair, right? Like, he has to explain the thought process of a room that he might not necessarily agree with. He does have to come up with some justifications that he might not necessarily agree with. But man, does it make it feel a little worse whenever you get an explanation that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's a great point. I saw that quote this morning among, right, like ADs going back and forth. I mean, like the shots have been fired between Iowa State and SMU talking about strength of schedule. And it's almost like ESPN has to love this, right? There's just more and more heat around this, right? I mean, it's not something necessarily you want to talk about, but you are talking about it, and it makes for interesting fodder. What team, if you think right now is on the outside looking in, has the biggest gripe as to, hey, what the heck's going on here?
Well, a team that's kind of all the way outside right now, I don't understand how BYU is being treated. They're being treated like that game against SMU in week 2 just never happened. They went on the road, beat number 8 SMU, and they're still number 19 as a 10-2 team. I pointed out yesterday, number 18. The number 17 team is Clemson, which is a 3-loss team. BYU has the 44th strength of schedule. Clemson has the 53rd strength of schedule. And yet, as a 3-loss team, they're still ahead of them. And if you look at a metric like strength of record, that usually coincides pretty well with the thought process of the CFP committee, BYU is actually number 12 in that metric. Now, look, Arizona State, of course, is going to be ahead of BYU as a fellow 2-loss team that has a head-to-head victory over BYU. But to me, BYU should be much closer to the top 15 of these rankings. And really all of these teams from the Big 12 should be more in contention with the South Carolinas, the Ole Misses, the Alabamas of the world, the Miami as well. So that to me was just really silly to me. And look, I think that also when you look at sort of that group of the Alabama, Ole Miss, Miami, and South Carolina, like if you're South Carolina, I get why you're a little peeved. Obviously, they have the head-to-head loss against Alabama that I think just probably has to be the difference. But outside of those games, and especially in the last half of the season, they've played incredibly well. They've been as good as anybody in college football over the past couple of weeks. So I get why you maybe hoped that your hot streak could get you in, but I do think that it probably worked out correctly.
We talk, you and I had a chance, we talked with Joey McGuire for that Inside the 12 show, and I know you've had many conversations with him, but there's a gripe there from conferences like the Big 12 as to maybe there's an overvaluing of the SEC. How real is that, Shehan?
Well, I do think that one, like we have to say, the SEC is the best conference in college football. I don't think it's that close. Like I do think that that's important to note. Where I grow frustrated is the idea that because the conference as a whole is strong, that we have to treat every individual conference member like they're strong. Because again, like there's this idea like, well, the SEC is really good, so they should have 4 or 5 teams in the playoff. Well, you have to judge each of those teams individually. When you look at the schedule right now, I think the numbers 13 out of their 16 teams have at least 3 losses. So you're talking about a 3-loss team needing to be that 4 team. And again, Alabama might be it as the 11 seed, but like it would not be a travesty if that team were to get left out. Like we have to get out of that mindset a little bit. And I think that again, like when you compare them to, you know, again, with the Big 10 teams that are going to be in outside of Ohio State, which again has 2 top 10 wins, the others have 1 or 0 losses. Like I think that that's fair for them to be in. When you look at SMU as a team that's projected to be in, they're a 1-loss team as a power conference team that has a top half schedule in the country. And that's also what's been so odd to me about the way that the Big 12 specifically has been treated, is that they're not being judged individually. It feels like they're being judged on the perceived strength of their conference. And so I think that sort of thing just ends up being very circular logic, where like, if you imagine that Georgia is the best team in the country, well, guess what? Like Ole Miss and Alabama beat them, so they must be, well, but like, the justification for them being the best is that you kind of think that you're the best. So you end up in this logic vortex that I think ultimately ends up hurting anybody who's not those teams.
How about this coming weekend? That's a great little bow you put on that. But how about this coming weekend? What game or scenario do you see as something that could play out outside of the ACC title game? Something else that could really greatly impact this 12-team playoff?
Yeah, well, of course, like you mentioned, the ACC title game will be huge. Obviously, it could be a bid-stealing type game. I'm going to be fascinated to watch the Mountain West title game as
Friday
well.
Night,
Friday.
Yeah,
Friday night. That's going to be between number 10 Boise State and number 20 UNLV. The winner of that game is assured, in my opinion, into the college football playoff, but it could decide a first-round bye. If Boise State wins that game, they're essentially a lock for the first 4 byes. If UNLV wins, most likely the Big 12 champion will get that 4th bye, and UNLV would probably be the 12th seed in that scenario. So I think that's going to be a pretty consequential game. I think the other thing too is going to be not just from the perspective of playoff seeding, but also from the perspective of proving championship caliber. Texas versus Georgia is going to be a really big game, because I think that the further that we get from that October 19th game between these two teams, the more that it feels like Texas kind of had a mental letdown in that game, that they were not prepared for that moment, and not necessarily that they are so much worse than Georgia this year. I think that if Texas comes back and let's say wins that game by 7 to 10 points in Atlanta, they join the ranks of Oregon and, I'd say Ohio State. Obviously, we kind of need to see how they're going to mentally respond from their Michigan loss. But I think that those become the 3 favorites to win the national championship if Texas is able to take care of business. And again, their path would get a lot easier if they are the 2 seed.
What is something that you think could be the biggest shocker? We're sitting around next week talking about this. Is there a team right now on the outside looking in that you foresee possibly could get in if the ball bounces their way? Any real long shot here?
Yeah, it's hard to find a long shot right now. I think that a lot of the math is there, and we heard from Ward Manuel that that most likely the teams that are not playing in the conference championship games are not going to move based on 1 week to another, which I think is fair. I don't think you have to say it because, like, again, maybe that Clemson win starts to become more valuable for anyway. But I think that that the biggest thing is going to be, I would not be surprised if Iowa State is the team that jumps up. And if Iowa State makes the field, let's say it's the 12th seed, and they're playing Penn State in the first round, I think that's not a bad matchup for them. I think that that's a team that they have the ability to attack on the outside and have some success against. I think they'd be able to shut down Penn State's offense. So it's really a matchup-based thing that I think that the Big 12 champion, if they're playing Penn State specifically in the first round, I think they could be in good shape.
Yeah, I mean, because Arizona State, Penn State looks a little different. It's going to be so interesting to see who is able to win that championship game. And you like Iowa State, correct?
Yeah, I do. I hate that it has to be because of an injury, but I think the Jordan Tyson injury at wide receiver for Arizona State is just going to be so tough. He had about 2/3 of their receiving yards from wide receivers this year. He was by far their leading touchdown guy, had over 70 catches. I don't know if they're going to be able to attack this Iowa State passing defense without Jordan Tyson in the lineup. Now, Iowa State isn't great against the run, but I just think that when you can focus your whole defense on stopping one guy, that guy being Cam Scadaboo, it's just going to be a really tough matchup. Now, I love Arizona State's offensive coordinator, Marcus Arroyo. He was from Oregon before, obviously was a head coach at UNLV, and kind of helped build that program to where Barry Odom could take it over and run. But it's just, I think, a math problem that they're going to struggle to solve. So I narrowly lean Iowa State in this game, but it's going to be a close one.
Well, what about your the coaching carousel has started to spin? Is there a wild rumor that you've heard that you can share? Something where people will be shocked to hear, like, oh, wow, this person is on the cusp of this job or in the mix for this job?
Well, I think that the most interesting one is going to be what happens at West Virginia, because there are two very big names that I think at least have some interest in that job. And that would be, of course, Rich Rodriguez, their former coach who led them to nearly the national title game in 2007, now at Jacksonville State. And the other is a native West Virginian son, Jimbo Fisher. So look, maybe they go in a different direction, but I do think that there is momentum for these things to happen. Certainly, the boosters, I think, would love to make a big hire. I think that they're going to be, West Virginia, much more committed to fulfilling the full payout of House v. NCAA payouts and revenue sharing, which I don't know that everybody expected. And so this becomes a really interesting opening on the market because, again, and you also compare it to the rest of the jobs in the field, I don't think they're going for the same type of candidate that a UCF or a North Carolina are going for. So they kind of have an interesting spot on the board, and I'm fascinated to see where it ends.
Yeah, and I think Ren Baker, the West Virginia's AD, is a bit of a gunslinger. He's done a really good job so far. He's done well, and I would not be surprised, like you mentioned, if they land one of those bigger names.
Yeah, and the other thing too, I've known Ren Baker since he was the athletic director at North Texas in my neck of the woods, and he is a tremendous fundraiser. He does a great job of getting boosters in alignment. And look, West Virginia is in some ways a tough place to beat, right? Like, it obviously doesn't have a ton of big fish. So when you get everybody working in the same direction, which I think Ren Baker can do, it makes for a really interesting circumstance. And I would even point to Ren Baker's arrival as to why Neil Brown was able to have some of the success he had over the last 2 years before they obviously moved on from him.
Yeah, and that's the only, you're the only show in town, although it is kind of difficult, you mentioned, to get people to go there. We're not talking about USC, but once you get there, that's it. You're the show.
Yeah, I remember talking to somebody over there who was like, I think that I talked to Ren a little bit at Big 12 Media Days last year, and he was like, the biggest difference for me is like, I had I think it was a women's basketball opening, and he got like a call from the governor for like giving his insight, right? Like, this is the sort of thing that doesn't happen when you're at North Texas or at a lot of these other jobs, right? I mean, even you look at some of the really good SEC jobs or really good Big 12 or ACC jobs, like, it's just not that dynamic. You are the governor of West Virginia when you're the head football coach at West Virginia University. And so I do think that that it's going to be fascinating to see not just who do they bring in from a football coaching perspective, but who's able to really step up and be that leader for the fan base and for the state.
A couple more things for you. First of all, it really is special that you shared your Spotify Wrapped with the world, and you're obviously an amazing father, because 1 through 5 we've got the top 4 all from the Frozen soundtrack. Congratulations to a job well done.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, obviously my 10-month-old has a lot to do with that, but this is really my wife's fault, because she made a Disney playlist, and it's like in order, of course, of like album by album, and the first 4 songs of it are, of course, from the Frozen soundtrack. So anytime that we put that on, it always cycles through those. So I think that I'm unfortunately done being able to get any use out of my Spotify Wrapped.
Well, and then, hey, number 5, Beyonce, Bodyguard, baby. There you go.
Yep. So, look, we try to mix it up a little bit. We're exposing her to culture, but obviously, sometimes you just want to toss something on and leave her be.
Shehan Jeyarajah, I was next to you yesterday. It was so much fun. I felt so much juice. I was waiting for you to get the confirmation on who the next West Virginia or North Carolina coach was going to be. So when you find out, you're going to have to let me know. But I appreciate you letting us find out all these nuggets today, man. It was a pleasure working with you yesterday. We'll look for Inside the 12 on Thursday. That's going to be on Big 12 Studios, YouTube. And, of course, it's going to cycle through I think it's on ESPN at 10 o'clock Central, ESPN 2 tomorrow night, and then it'll run a bunch of times. So great job. Pleasure working with you. Of course, you can catch them CBS Sports Zone. We appreciate you spending time with us, Shehan.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, brother.